So in the previous example, we imported pandas and we used its data frame import, right? Its data frame capability to display a table of student IDs and ages. In our next example, we're asked to calculate and display the number of rows and columns of this new data frame called players. So here we sort of have a table of various columns, 5 columns, and where we have many records for each column. And we're asked to display the number of rows and columns of players. I mean, you might be thinking, for this case, we can just count it very easily. There's 5 columns, and I would say about over here, it says the expected output should be 10, right? So there's 10 rows. We can just count this. But Pandas is very useful for and very fast at working with data sets that are millions of entries. So calculating the number of rows and columns in large or very large data sets comes in very handy. So I won't be creating this complete data set because it'll take too long, but I'll create some of the entries. Like I explained for our previous example, I'm just going to leave a little bit of room. So for this one, we have to create a variable first, right? That holds some of the data. So I'll call this player underscore data. And it's going to be, let's sort of say we're only keeping 5 rows. So our initial list is, just an empty list. Then we want to create the first row, second row, the third row, the fourth row, the fifth row. Let's make another one, 6 rows. For each row, we have the values 846. Then the name is Mason. Then we have 21 as the age. Then the position is forward. And the team is Real Madrid. So that's for our first column. I think if I indent it over here, it should also work. And to be honest, it looks much more neat. So I'm able to indent it right after the commas. And I can even, wrap it around like this. So even from the get-go, it looks like a table. So I'm just going to copy this over because there'll be a lot of work to retype everything. And I'll change, some of the numbers, 749, 155, 583, 388, and 355. You should also be following along because this is great practice for you to start coding with Python. Isabella, Zachary, Violet, 30, 28, 32, 24, 23, winger, striker, goalkeeper, midfielder, defender. And I think I'm going to leave the teams as is because I think you get the point. So I'm going to run the cell. If I want to just quickly check if the values were saved, I can run it independently here. You can see we have the same values. And we're really asked to write a solution that calculates and displays the number of rows and columns of players. So we haven't even created players yet, which is a data frame called players. So let's do that quickly. So we're going to create a new variable called players. And as from the previous example, we use pandas and then we write data frame. One thing to really stress is this is case sensitive. So if I were to write lowercase d and lowercase f, it's going to give me an error. Let me just try. So the data is player data. Columns is, notice how also for this example, I didn't create a new column, a variable called columns, right? In this example, I created a new column and then I just passed it in. So another option we have, which I don't recommend actually, because it makes things a little messy, is we can directly add the columns in the data frame, uh, you know, where the data frame expects it. So let's see how that would look like. We can write player ID, name, age, position, and team. And so this list is closed, but I'm going to close everything off with a parentheses, which wraps this whole data frame. It finishes it off. Remember this should not be working because I changed the case sensitivity. It says pandas has no attribute data frame, which means I don't know what this data frame thing is, right? So to fix it, you have to remember to capitalize the D and the F when creating a data frame. And now we're not getting any red errors, which is good. So now if I print players, I should be seeing a nice list of IDs, names, right? So it sort of looks exactly like this, except this one has more entries. And our main goal here is to calculate the number of rows and columns. So to calculate the number of rows, we can use this function in Python called len, which basically stands for length. And all we have to do is pass in our whole table. So if I run this, and I'm going to switch to Markdown quickly. Here we used the len function to calculate the number of rows in our players table. So if I print out rows, notice how I ran the cell already and we have no errors. I get 6, which is correct, right? Initially we started with 6 rows, right? Remember that Python starts with 0. So 0 up to 5, we have 6 rows. And to calculate the number of columns, this one, there's many ways to do this. So one of the ways is to just write, again, we can use the len function, and just write players, just write players dot columns. So this gives us the length of the number of columns in this players table. And let me just write that down quickly. This gives us the length of the number of columns in the players table. If I run calls now, I should be getting 5, right? So I got 5. In both cases, we used the len function, something very neat that Pandas gives us right off the bat is we can use this thing called uh, players.shape. So if I just run this, players is already a table of type data frame. So that gives it some additional functionality. And we're able to add this dot shape at the end. And if we run this, we get a nice, output, which basically tells us how many rows and columns players has. So this is another way to display the number of rows and columns. Another way to display rows and calls for a data frame. So remember, this can only be used for a type that's of, a variable which is of type data frame. Remember, if I check the type of players, it should be a data frame. If I check the type of player data, which is what the actual data was, what do you think it would be? So it should be a list, right? So this is sort of interesting. We passed in a list, right? Which was our initial list here, into another variable called players. We created a data frame out of it. And now this new variable called players is a data frame. If I were to do dot shape on player data, I wouldn't expect it to give, any meaningful answer. So it says it has no attribute shape, which means this attribute shape doesn't exist for lists. It only exists for data frames. So that's something to keep in mind. But remember, we haven't completed the question yet. It asks us to display the number of rows and columns, and it should be something like this. This data frame contains 10 rows and 5 columns. So we're going to make use of f strings, if you remember from our previous videos, which allows us to embed variables inside, sentences, so we can easily display information. So I'm going to just write a print statement, which allows me to print sentences, and just write this data frame contains rows, which is whatever value would be in this rows variable, rows, and calls columns. Okay. So now we have this information and this information coming directly from the values that are stored in these two variables. And it's not hard-coded. If I were to add another entry, let's sort of just do this very quickly. 247, Thomas 27, and I'll leave everything else the same. I'm going to rerun this raw data, and then I'm going to check that our new row is added. I'm going to run this again so that our new row is also added. And when I run this, I should be seeing another row. So you see how the other row that we just added is now displayed. If I check the length of the rows now, it should be 7, sorry. 7, and the columns stays the same. And now, if I run this again, it updated without me changing anything in this print statement. So that's why, f strings are very useful, because it takes the data directly from the variables, and we're not hard coding things so that we have to go and change them later on.